All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 16th, 1975, Joan Little, age 21, is acquitted of second-degree murder. This was a monumental decision in many ways, as Joan Little had killed a man who was attempting to rape her. We should say that this incident took place in jail. Little was a prisoner. Her assaulter was a prison guard. Those details certainly play into the case. But it's the verdict, this acquittal, that really left a legacy, because Little was the first woman to be acquitted of murder committed in self-defense against sexual assault. So, here to discuss the case and legacy of the Joan Little case are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Kellie, you were saying you teach Joan Little in one of your classes?
In
what context?
So I teach a course called From Mumbet to Michelle Obama. It's the history of Black women in America. And one of the weeks, we talk about sexual assault. And we read this really good book by Danielle McGuire. It's called At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, Resistance, and a New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. It's a really long title, but it's a really
academic subtitle.
It's a really good one. It's such a powerful book. In it, she talks about Reese Taylor, who some of our listeners might be familiar with. She talks about Rosa Parks, but she has a whole chapter on Joan Little, and it's so good because she gives just all of the history and the texture of this case, really unprecedented case. And so my students have never heard of this before. And so it's always really great to introduce them to something new and then talk about all of the nuances that go along with this case.
Yeah. And, paint a picture a little bit of Joan Little herself. I don't think she starts out as a civil rights icon or a legacy maker. I mean,
Yes. What I love about Joan Little is that she was a regular, ordinary woman who was somewhat troubled as a teenager. She gets into a little bit of trouble with the law. She was arrested several times. She had like a spate of arrests for theft and things of that nature, which to me is really interesting because, so much of the civil rights movement was about having the politics of respectability, having someone who could be upheld as like this role model or this high standard of Black excellence, and that was, Rosa Parks. But when you think about someone like Joan Little, she does not have that record at all. And so when this assault happens, it happens while she's incarcerated. So it's not as though this is something that happens while she's walking home from church, as in it does with Reese Taylor. And what happens after this, I think, is just so remarkable because it marks the first time that women were entitled to self-defense regardless of their background, regardless of what previous crimes they had committed.
I do think that context makes this such a unusual case to be the groundbreaking case, to be the one where a court finally says, you know what, women do have a right to fight back when they're facing sexual assault. And to have someone like Joan Little at the middle of this feels really important, especially in an era where, you know, women who were coming forward after being raped were still being asked, like, what were you wearing? And having to meet these moral tests.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly, you know, sexual assault within prisons. I mean, talk about a place where there is so little sunlight and so little awareness. You know, and the person who was attempting to rape her, the jailer at the Beaufort County Jail, was someone who had a record and reputation of forcing female inmates to take part in sexual favors in exchange for, you know, gifts that he'd give them or payments. And so he, you know, attempts to assault her, and she stabs him in the temple and heart and is killed. She escapes. About a week later, she turns herself in and starts to mount this defense that she was defending herself against sexual assault. But she's put on trial for murder. And you started to paint a little bit of that picture, Kelly, but, you know, it really does attract Angela Davis, Rosa Parks, Larry Little. I mean, you know, the civil rights movement that is, you know, in full force really comes to the aid here. Do you have a sense of how her story gets out there? Because you could see a scenario in which this story, no one really, you know, no one hears about.
Yes, in which this is a story that you would totally believe would fall through the cracks. But this is like the first, I would say, public relations incident in which you see Black and white feminists coming together to push this collective cause. Oftentimes, Black and white feminists were at odds in terms of their goals. But this is something that, you know, people wanted to push back on this idea of like the promiscuous Jezebel, or the idea that you don't have a right to your own body, the fact that women of all races needed to break this code of silence. And so this really becomes a galvanizing case in which I encourage people to go on to YouTube, because there's a really great clip in which you see activists that are protesting for her case, for her release, and you have Black men on there talking about what it means to like have her gain her freedom. Yeah. Angela Davis is also being interviewed. Sweet Honey in the Rock creates a song just to galvanize people around her case. So it really does become something that gets national attention in the same way that you would see like the Montgomery bus boycott getting attention.
It's also one of those cases where, you know, the politics of rape were so central to white supremacy throughout U.S. history. And when a Black man was even accused of rape by a white woman, there would be mobs assembled in order to extrajudicially murder him. And this is kind of flipping that context. What about the virtue of Black womanhood? What does it mean when a white man rapes a Black woman? And this is actually what the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Ralph Abernathy, says about this case. He says, I asked North Carolina if there was a white woman who had stabbed a Black man who was attempting to rape her, would that white woman be on trial today? That white woman would be given a Medal of Honor, which I think is a pretty important reframing in that moment, especially because Little was facing the death penalty if she was convicted.
Yeah. What's also remarkable about this case is that, you know, Rosa Parks is there, and Rosa Parks started out her political or civil rights career not with the Montgomery bus boycott, as we find out in this book, At the Dark End of the Street, but she was an advocate for sexual assault victims. One of her first cases is Recy Taylor's sexual assault case. And it's not until years later, really decades later, that Rosa Parks herself reveals that she was almost sexually assaulted. And she talks about how, you know, she threatened to kill this man as well, and basically said, you know, I was never going to yield to this white man. She said, I was ready to die. I would never give him my consent. And then she says, this is Rosa Parks, if he wanted to kill me and rape a dead body, he was welcome, but he would have to kill me first. And I was like, whoa, like this is just the Rosa Parks that you don't know, because so much of the story of sexual assault is really just covered in silence. And so to have women speaking out, to me, I thought this case was even more important than Montgomery bus boycott, because sexual assault is so violent and so harmful and means so much more than just where you ride on a bus. I'm not trying to trivialize, segregation on public transportation, but sexual assault was really at the heart of a lot of the grievances that Black women had during the civil rights movement.
Some details from the trial. I mean, the prosecution's defense here was that Little was a promiscuous woman who had seduced this white man in order to murder him, this white jailer in order to murder him and then escape from prison, which is also just this like perverse inversion of the usual tropes of who's seducing whom. Often it was the case that, and then the defense just some of the details of the trial were just like the defense counsel was just like seemed like a real shithead and was
the defense counsel was a nut.
Yeah. You want to talk about some of those details? I mean, he got thrown in jail himself, right?
He gets thrown in jail, not for like vociferously defending his client, but because he's making derogatory comments about the judge, which is a big no-no, right? Your client's life is on the line. Maybe you can show a little deference. But then afterwards, he is interviewed by the New York Times. He stopped lawyering because he's become famous through this trial. And so he decides he can make more money out on the lecture circuit. He says he's bored with the law. And he says, the American justice system, here's how it works. It's not, figuring out who's right and who's wrong. It's who can buy the best defense. And there is this kind of interesting criticism of the American legal system that deserves criticism underneath that, but you really get a frat boy at 2 a.m. after a night of smoking pot vibe from him.
Yeah. But nevertheless, there was a successful case here. It's a jury of 6 African Americans and 6 white Americans, and they deliberate for just an hour and 25 minutes and return this verdict of not guilty.
But she still has to serve.
Yeah,
she still has to serve out her sentence. So she's still in jail. She won't, get the death penalty, right, but she's still incarcerated. I think that's also something that's, interesting about this story is that it's not as though she gets freed, she goes out and she becomes this like leader of the movement or whatever. She's still a troubled woman who really needed more help than what she got. This case saved her from the death penalty, but it didn't necessarily rescue her from a life of crime.
Yeah.
She still has troubles after this.
Yeah, she goes back to serve the remainder of her sentence for breaking and entering, and then I think a month before she would have been eligible for parole, she escapes, and then she's caught a number of times back in jail, and then really in the late 80s or 90s, she sort of pops up, I think, getting in trouble with the law again, but then it's kind of receded since then, though I think there's a good chance she's still alive. Joan Little was born in 1953, and so we don't know, but she has not remained in the public light at all since this moment. So as we wrap up, I mentioned this is the first time someone has mounted a defense of this kind. That really is the legacy here, is introducing this.
Yeah, it set the precedent that women have a right to self-defense regardless of their background. They have a right to defend themselves, even if they are incarcerated.
Yeah.
And it's shocking that it's 1975, and this is when we're setting this precedent. But it's also a good reminder of how, in some ways, loose the laws around rape were, right? It's not until the 1990s that marital rape becomes a crime. So there really is a kind of, this is of a piece with a legal recognition of women's bodily autonomy, which is just coming into view in the 1970s.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Really fascinating story. And what was that? What's that book again, Kelly? You want to shout it out?
At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle McGuire. I won't give you the whole title.
Yeah, then a very long look for At the Dark End of the Street, and then a really long subtitle, and that's the book.
Yes, by Danielle McGuire.
Okay. And I should say, Danielle McGuire, who wrote that, we had her on for an episode we did about Recy Taylor and Rosa Parks. So you can go back and check that out after you read At the Dark End of the Street. All right. Well, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Well, I think that this is one of the most significant cases concerning any black person in the past 30 or 40 years in the history of the United States. We feel it's so important because it goes to the very heart of the question as to whether or not a black woman has the right to defend herself when she's the victim of a white racist, sexist attack. And we feel Joan Little acted in self-defense, and we feel that the way this question is answered will have tremendous repercussions throughout this country in regards to the life that black women are able to live.
Radiotopia.